Welcome to How to Research Your Historic Property. My name is Matthew Pierce. I'm the National Register Coordinator at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. You can find my contact information there towards the bottom of the slide. You can reach me via email at matthewpierce@history.ok.gov. You can also reach me via phone at 405-522-4479. If you have any questions about today's presentation, feel free to contact me anytime and I will be happy to help you out. So let's get started. So when you're about to start your research for historic property, keep the following three things in mind. First, organization. Decide what you need to know and where you can find it. You can make a list of the questions you want to answer. You can make a list of specific tasks, knowing where you need to go, to whom you need to speak, and what you expect to find. One thing to always remember is that the property itself is a primary source of information. Next is identification. Identify what historic information is readily available. Perhaps it's in a collection from the owners of that property. It could be a neighbor, or it could be a collection of sources that's available in the local community. And then last, be sure to identify and contact research facilities. And it's important to contact those facilities well in advance and know exactly what materials they have that you need to look at. So throughout today's presentation, we're going to keep coming back to this particular property as an example. This is the McLean home. It was in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma County. It's located just northwest, of the Oklahoma State Capitol building. It was built in 1911. It's set on a roughly 2-acre property. It was used for a family residence, or used as a family residence for almost 80 years, and it was listed in the National Register in November of 2020 at the local level of significance under Criterion C for its architectural significance. And so throughout the presentation, remember that the property itself is the primary source of information. And as an example, kind of as a guide today, we'll keep coming back to this particular property as an example. So foremost, there are different types of historical evidence. First, there are primary sources, or those first-hand accounts of events that come directly from participants. These can be written documents, such as a memoir or a diary or a newspaper article, maybe written like the day after the event happened. They could also be non-written. Think about maps or historic photographs or videos or artifacts, for example. You also have secondary sources, or the findings of those that were not direct participants of an event but have investigated related primary evidence. The most common example of a secondary source that I assume you all have come across is a history book, or perhaps a journal article. If you read the Chronicles of Oklahoma, for example, any secondary source is going to be based off of a collection of, or a combination of primary sources and secondary sources. And if you're researching a historic property with the intent of preparing a National Register nomination, the National Register nomination itself will become a secondary source. It's going to be based off of a combination of primary sources and secondary sources to tell the story of that particular property and why it's significant. So before you start your research, always start with the SHPO. I can't stress that enough. Our responsibility as an office is to identify, evaluate, and nominate properties to the National Register of Historic Places. And we identify and evaluate most resources through survey work. Some of that work is accomplished through cooperative arrangements with universities or local governments. And we also conduct surveys on a wide range of property types and themes, in which maybe we identify individual properties, and more importantly, we oftentimes will help provide a context through which to evaluate properties for National Register eligibility. So we've done surveys on a wide range of topics, for instance, mid-century modern architecture, New Deal public art, and then all the individual resources that we document as part of those survey projects get recorded into the Oklahoma Landmarks Inventory. And that's our collection of information that we have compiled on thousands of individual properties throughout the state. And while the level of documentation might vary depending on the specific property, it can provide a baseline for your research. So before you even start doing research for a nomination, ask yourself, has that property ever been documented by our office in the past? And if it has, that can provide you with a good baseline for which to start your research, because for certainly you don't want to start doing detailed research on a property if it turns out we have enough documentation in our files that show that that property isn't eligible for the National Register, for instance. So always start with our office. Ask the SHPO. All right, so let's get a little bit more into detail about some of the specific sources of information that you might come across in your research. And I'm going to provide a wide range of examples here. I wouldn't expect anyone to try to find sources under each of these categories while doing research. For instance, the abstract of title might be your primary collection of documents that you use. But this is more kind of to give you a sense of the different types of resources you might come across as you're doing research on historic properties. So first and foremost, the abstract of title, that's kind of the holy grail when it comes to doing property research. If you can get your hands on the abstract of title for a particular property, because it can tell you the deeds, mortgages, wills, the names of owners of that property. It can give you the dates on when that property changed hands, an idea about the legal boundaries. It can give you a wealth of information. If you can't get access to the abstract of title, there's these other types of sources that are available. You can try to pull the building permits. You can look at cemetery or census records. So for instance, census records will give you the residents of a particular property, whether or not they own that property or perhaps maybe rent the property. It can give you an idea about the ethnic or racial background of residents, the ages and the education levels of the people who lived on that property. If it's an agricultural property, you can find an agricultural census, and it might give you an idea about the amount of acreage that that particular landowner owned or cultivated, and it can also give you an idea about the different types of crops or livestock that were raised on that property. All of these types of sources are examples of primary sources. These are sources that are written or recorded at the time that the event happened, whether it's the sale of the property or whether it's when the census occurred or when the building was constructed. All of those can help you establish dates of construction, dates of occupancy, can give you an idea about how a property might be potentially associated with the person. All of these can give you what you need to establish what every nomination has, which is a period of significance. In other words, that time frame in which the property attained significance. So pay attention to dates of construction, maybe the time in which the property was occupied by a particular person or family, or the period of use in which that property attained significance. I want to spend a little bit of time looking specifically at architectural drawings. If you're researching a building, and that's the primary topic for today's presentation, we're kind of looking specifically at buildings. Along with the abstract of title, architectural drawings, if you can find them, are a very valuable resource. They can give you information about the architect and the builder. It can give you an idea about the building plan, the materials that were used for the design and construction, and also dates of construction or any alterations. And so this is on the screen here is an example from the American Legion Hall and Municipal Auditorium in Bristow. These images are courtesy of the Tulsa Foundation for Architecture. The building was designed in the early 1930s, and this is just a snippet from the south elevation, which is the primary elevation. And if you could zoom in, you could see that this drawing gives you an idea of the types of materials used for the exterior. You can see notes about a stone coping and stone sills, blonde face brick, Those types of things are available when you look at the drawings and give you an idea about the types of details, all those things. And then in the lower right, I have I've cropped the example from the title block, which gives you the building's name, auditorium building for the American Legion, post Klingelsmith in Bristow, Oklahoma, and also gives you the name of the architect, in this case, Joseph Koberling out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In some cases, the title block might also give you the name of the engineer or general contractor that's also going to be used on the property. The title block might also include dates of revision. So maybe the first drawing set was issued in 1934, and then maybe a new set was prepared in 1935, and that there's oftentimes a little grid that lets you know when the drawing set was revised and when. So all of those things are pretty useful to have. Where can you find drawings? Take a look at organizations like the Tulsa Foundation for Architecture, especially if you're researching a property in Northeast Oklahoma, particularly in the Tulsa area. The Oklahoma City Foundation for Architecture also has a small collection of drawings, and both organizations are working pretty hard at making those, at A, cataloging those drawings, and B, making them available digitally. So be sure to reach out to those groups. If it's a public building, say like a courthouse or a library, check city or county records. It's possible that the city or county government maintains a collection of drawings for its public buildings. You can also take a look at the local and state historical societies, and also don't forget to check out the building itself. I don't know how many times that when I'm doing research on a property, on a building in particular, and the original drawings are rolled up in a corner of the basement, or they're hidden up in the attic somewhere. And so don't forget to check out the building itself as well to try to track down architectural drawings. Other sources of information that you can look at, genealogical records. I assume many of you, if you're viewing this video, you might have some familiarity with Ancestry.com and how that's become just a really vast database to access a variety of genealogical records, including census records, cemetery records, city directories, all those types of things. Other types of sources you could look at, homestead records, that could come into play specifically if you're looking at a more rural property, or maybe it is a property that's associated with the original homestead of that property. So, you can take a look at that. Oral histories can be very useful. Any personal recollections about the property, maybe a local library or a historical society has collected oral histories of a particular town or county. You might also take a look at university libraries or public libraries as well to see if they've collected those things. These types of sources can be used in combination with the sources presented in the previous slides, again, to establish the National Register criteria a property could be listed under. In other words, you can start to assess why the property is significant. You can start to understand its potential period of significance, and it can also give you an idea of how to assess the property's historic integrity. So for instance, on the slide here, the plat that I have was used to help establish integrity of location and setting for the McLean home. This addition was platted in 1902. The McLean home is located in Block 21, which is outlined in red, at the corner of what was originally 25th Street and Nebraska Avenue, now Walnut Avenue. The Barrows, that's referenced in the title Barrows Second Edition, is in reference to the family that originally homesteaded the property. And it turned out, when I was doing my research for this, of course I was curious, how did this plat acquire the name Barrows? And come to find out that a descendant of the Barrows family was interviewed in an oral history collection called the Indian Pioneer Papers, which is cataloged at the Oklahoma History Center, and it's also available digitally through the University of Oklahoma libraries. So I was able to find that oral history and learn about how the property was originally homesteaded, and then how the Barrows family ended up selling the property, and then essentially how it was subdivided and how this into its present form that allowed subsequent owners to come in to buy individual parcels. So all these sources are connected in one way or another. Newspapers. never fails that newspapers are probably the most common source that people will use to do their research on a particular property, and I felt it warranted to have a slide dedicated specifically to newspapers, because more and more newspapers are becoming available through digital means. And so I have some examples here of some newspaper articles and the types of sources or types of collections that have access to these various newspapers. Of course, newspapers are going to contain a wealth of information. Of course, there's advertisements. If you're researching a particular person's especially someone who's significant to the local community, the society pages, the obituaries, those are going to be fairly useful. Early newspapers, especially if it's a notable building in a small town, you'll likely come across newspaper articles that keep track of local building efforts. And then similarly, if you're, again, researching a significant person, of course, the newspaper is going to keep track of birth, wedding, and death announcements. That could very well be useful in your research. So the newspaper clippings that I have here cover the progress of the construction of the Will Rogers Library in Claremore, and they covered the entire period of the property's significance, from the original donation of the property from the proceeds of its sale from Will Rogers in 1934. That's the article in the left, titled "Will Rogers Makes the Library Possible," to the note in the upper right that discusses how construction of the building was proceeding in 1936. And there you learn that construction was associated with several other New Deal construction projects in the 1930s, with the mention of the WPA and PWA. And then last, in the lower right, is a photograph in the building from the newspaper shortly after its completion in 1937. So where to find newspapers? Your first stop should likely be the Oklahoma Historical Society. The Historical Society was founded in 1893, and its primary purpose was to collect and save newspapers in Oklahoma Territory. Of course, its mission has expanded since then, but that was its primary purpose. And to this day, the Historical Society has a vast collection of newspapers. These newspapers are available if you go to the Research Center, and you can look at them on microfilm, and an increasing number of newspapers are becoming available digitally through the Gateway to Oklahoma History. And you can find these papers. They're often categorized by the particular town or title. The Historical Society has also worked to digitize newspapers that are associated with particular ethnic or racial communities. So for instance, African American newspapers in Oklahoma, a good number of those have been digitized, or student newspapers. I believe the Historical Society has digitized some of the university papers or student newspapers from the University of Oklahoma, for instance. Be sure to also check out any local or college university libraries and historical societies. So for instance, we recently processed some additional documentation for a nominated building on the Murray State College campus, and that additional documentation utilized articles from the campus newspaper. Those copies were available on campus. The author had access to those newspapers, and they really helped make a case for the property's significance. You can also take a look at online databases. There's a number of different databases. Bear in mind, some of these you have to pay for subscriptions. Newspapers.com in particular, newspaperarchive.com, both of those are paid subscription databases, but if you pay to have access to them, you can get access to a wide range of historic newspapers. You might also check out, with your local library, if they subscribe to any particular newspaper databases, such as Newsbank. Newsbank has a database specific for Oklahoma newspapers. The Oklahoman also has its own digital archive that you can access. So again, there's a variety of ways to access newspapers. They're a very, very valuable resource. Other sources of information. We're moving now into more secondary sources. So And these are the types of sources that, maybe after you've taken a look at the abstract of title, or you've done your newspaper research and you need to maybe provide some additional context. These are the types of sources that can help you do that. So pay attention to community or county or state histories. Again, the Oklahoma Historical Society's Research Center is a good place to start. A number of counties have their own published histories, or of course there's a number of state histories that have been published, or histories of, say the city of Tulsa or the city of Oklahoma City, or histories of the land run, or any number of specific subjects in Oklahoma history. You could always look at those for references. Architectural journals can be very useful, especially if you're looking at a property that was associated with a particular architect or with a particular style. If it's a commercial property, you could take a look at a commercial history, or find the history of that particular industry or business, or those types of things. I also have an image of a city directory, in this case the Polk's Directory of Oklahoma City in 1928, and city directories are really valuable resources. Well, they can give you that information about, when a certain person lived at a property, or what type of business occupied a building, at a certain location, how long they were there, who was associated with it, all those types of things. So those are very, very, very useful. These can really help you, again, as I mentioned earlier, provide, the more contextual information that you need to help connect the dots from your primary sources to help justify why your particular property is significant. So for instance, if you're making the case that a particular property has commercial significance, you may need to rely on, a commercial history or a state history to help put that property into context in order to justify that significance. All right, let's move to photographs. Again, if we're looking at buildings, we're looking at the built environment, historic photographs or postcards are extremely valuable resources. And again, similar to newspapers, these are more and more of these have become are becoming accessible because of digitization efforts. So photographs are going to give you an idea about key architectural features or key landscape features. They can alert you to the presence of any associated structures, and they can give you a sense about alterations. In short, they can give you a sense of how the built environment has changed over time. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't emphasize the importance of the Gateway to Oklahoma history here. Again, it has a wide range of historic photographs that are available, for a number of buildings in the state. I will say, a good number of its collections in terms of historic photographs might be centered mainly in central Oklahoma, but that's not always the case. If you're researching a property in Tulsa, you might check out the Tulsa Historical Society. They have their own photo database that can give you an idea about what historic photographs are available. And again, similar to what I mentioned earlier about newspapers, be sure to check out your local historical societies, your local libraries. If you're in vicinity of a university or college library, be sure to check those out as well and see what types of photographs they may have available, either digitally or you may have to go there in person, but see what they have. The photos that I have here as an example are of Whittier School in Oklahoma City. It was listed in 2021 at the local level of significance under criterion A for education and under criterion C for architecture. So the top photograph there in the upper right was taken in 1910, just before the building opened to students. So that gave us a really good idea of the building's original design. You can see, the two entrances on the end, and then the bays of windows in the middle. And then the photo in the bottom right-hand corner was taken in 1957 when the school was about to close. And you can notice there's, at some point between 1910 and 1957, we see two additions had been constructed, one to each end, and one on each end of the building. And so, those two photographs kind of were able to provide a bookend of the property's period of significance, which essentially became 1910 to 1957, from when it opened to when it closed, and it gave us an idea of some of the alterations that had taken place, such as the two significant additions. The window openings had been modified somewhat. Particularly, notice the alterations to the paneling between the second and third story windows. But overall, at the same time, we get a good sense of how the building, was able to maintain its historic integrity throughout this period. It continued to be used as a school, and so again, these were pretty valuable resources to have as we were doing our research for the nomination. Maps. Again, hopefully one thing you're seeing by watching this presentation is the variety of sources that are available, and not everything has to be a written source, such as a newspaper or a diary entry. There's a lot of visual elements to this as well that you can use, such as photographs, or in this case, maps. Maps are going to be able to tell you, location, land ownership, the location of major thoroughfares or other notable properties. And so these are really useful to help you assess a property's location, its boundaries, its uses, and again, the presence of any maybe potentially associated structures or outbuildings. So the map to the left, this was a map that was produced. It's just a snippet from a General Land Office map of Choctaw County. And then the map on the right, was included in a nomination form for the Edwards Hardaway Homestead. This is just so this gives you a sense of, you can use everything from, official government maps, that of course are to scale and give you the legal, the legal locations of things, to, these, and to, on the right, you have just a map that was kind of created from memory and from accounts of all the different notable resources that were associated with this particular resource, the Edwards Hardaway Homestead. The location of the cabin, the store, the presence of a well shaft, a cemetery, the feedlot. All of this is not necessarily to scale, but it still was really helpful because it gave us an idea of where things were located in relation to each other, which was particularly important in this case because not all of these resources are extant. For instance, the store that's towards the lower left, that building is no longer extant. It's, any evidence of that building's location has to be done through archaeological research at this point. And so again, but just gives you a good sense of how historically the property was situated and how things were related to each other. So maps are a very valuable resource. Other types of common maps, especially if you're looking at properties that are located in an urban setting, are fire insurance maps, namely Sanborn Fire Insurance maps or Clarkson Fire Insurance maps. And these maps were a product created to help fire insurance companies assess potential risks involved with underwriting policies. And so as such, they include detailed information regarding towns and building construction. Sanborns are probably the best known of these, and many editions of Sanborn maps are available through the Library of Congress, and also, for instance, I have the Metropolitan Library System here. If you're in Oklahoma County, for instance, the Metropolitan Library System has a subscription to a database that includes a vast collection of Sanborn maps. Clarksons were earlier than Sanborns to a certain extent. And but the Oklahoma Historical Society, through the Gateway to Oklahoma History, they have a digital collection of Clarkson maps, and so the map in the kind of the upper left here that's a Clarkson map from downtown Stillwater in 1902, and then in the lower right, that's just a snippet from a Sanborn map from Oklahoma City in 1948, and overall, Sanborn maps were published between 1867 and 1970. Clarkson maps in Oklahoma date from 1892 to 1931. So again, Clarkson maps, if you're researching in a small town that might date to around, say, the land run or shortly thereafter, you might, check to see if there's a Clarkson map available. Sanborn maps, you're going to have a much wider range in terms of when those maps could be available, depending on which town you're researching. One thing with these types of maps, it's important to remember that they were made for a very specific use. And so although now they're valuable for a variety of purposes, whether it's to, know building function, know where a building was located, it's, those types of things. At the time, the insurance industry dictated the selection of information to be mapped and the way that that information was portrayed. And so if you're working with Sanborn maps, knowledge of the keys and the colors is essential to properly interpret the information found on these maps. And so each map has a key that accompanies, the subsequent sheets that show the respective city. And knowledge of that key is essential. So just to give you an example of what I mean here, this is to the right, you have the layout of First Unitarian Church in Oklahoma City in 1949. So the numbers in the upper right-hand corners of the various building sections show that the building is 1 and 2 stories in height. The B that you see is, say, like 2B or 1B, that stands for basement. So that says that those sections of the building are 1 story plus basement or 2 story plus basement. The central block of the building, which is labeled Sunday School, is 1 story plus basement and has a composition roof. That's indicated by the dark, the dark circle there towards the upper right-hand corner. Composition roof, means it's a composition roof material such as asphalt shingles or something like that. The neighboring section to the left is the sanctuary, and it's colored in pink. That indicates that it's a brick building, whereas the neighboring sections to the right, which are a combination of yellow and pink, that gives you that indicates that these are brick veneer buildings. So it's frame construction with brick veneer. The sanctuary has a non-combustible roof supported by steel trusses. Non-combustible means that roof is a fireproof material. Could be metal, could be tile shingles, could be asbestos shingles. The maps weren't necessarily specific on what type of material was used. They were more interested in, well, was it fireproof or not? Was it combustible or not? So that's why you have combustible roof or composition roof. And the steeple is indicated at the north end of the sanctuary. The gray circle that's kind of in the middle there, that indicates the metal spire. And then you have some, if you could zoom in, you could be able to tell that spire is 30 feet in height. The right section of the building, which is indicated by the letter D, that's the parsonage. D indicates dwelling. So like the neighboring buildings to the left and right, they're indicated D as dwellings. And so that lets you know that's where the parsonage is. If you looked at Sanborn maps over time, you would likely notice important changes to the building, such as the construction of an addition, or maybe changes in exterior materials. It wasn't all that uncommon from a building that appeared in one map to be have a frame exterior, be a frame construction, wood exterior, and then in a subsequent addition, it adds a brick veneer or something like that. So Sanborn maps are really useful for evaluating buildings and their change over time. If you work with Sanborns enough, this kind of brief example here might seem overwhelming. If you work with Sanborns enough, you get to where you understand the language and understand what they're telling you. And again, the key thing to be paying attention to is materials and what other changes have happened. Like, have there been additions? Those types of things. So Sanborns are really useful resources. Another valuable source of information, of course, are aerial photographs. And similar to newspapers, we have a wealth of aerial photography that's available through a variety of locations. I just have a few of the examples here. Oklahoma State University, for instance, maintains a statewide inventory of aerial photographs. It's not fully comprehensive, but you can look. They have their inventory broken down by county and by year. So you could search for, okay, I'm looking for aerial photographs of Atoka County. You can find that. It can give you the years that those aerial photographs are available, and you can reach out to them directly, and you can even specify, hey, I'm interested in this specific location, 123 Broadway Street. Please provide me the aerial photographs for that location, and they can provide those for you. The Oklahoma Historical Society, through the Gateway, has access to a number of aerial photographs. The Oklahoma Department of Libraries has, similar to OSU, they have a statewide Oklahoma aerial photography inventory. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission maintains, they're still updating this over time, a searchable aerial photography viewer that they've adapted, and they've utilized GIS technology to where if you go to that link, it'll take you to their map, and you can zoom in and then click on the specific area that you're interested in, and it'll bring up all the various aerial photos of that location that are available. And in most cases, you're able to download those photographs. And then a few other ones as well: historicaerials.com, the U.S. Geological Survey, and I assume many of you are familiar with Google Earth, and even they have an aerial photograph inventory that goes back over a few decades now at this point. And in any case, aerial photographs can do a couple of things for you. They can fill in the gaps that aren't covered by Sanborn maps. So for my research, for instance, for the McLean house, the property was originally located outside of the city limits for Oklahoma City, which meant it wasn't documented in any of the Sanborn maps that were available. So aerial photographs were the only thing that I had to work with. And two, this is becoming particularly the case for properties that were constructed in the mid to late 20th century, which we're documenting more and more of those. More and more of those properties are becoming eligible for the National Register. Those types of properties just were not documented in the Sanborns. If anything, the Sanborns may have documented the first, second, and maybe third generations of development on that particular property. For instance, our office has recently processed several nominations where the Sanborn maps don't show the nominated property. It might show the building that was on that property before the nominated building was constructed. So the Sanborn maps aren't really useful in that particular case. Still, if you use aerial photographs and Sanborn maps, these can give you a really good idea of change over time, which again is really important for when you're trying to assess integrity. And one thing I will mention is, the Park Service and our review committee, they oftentimes like to see aerial photography or Sanborn maps accompany the nominations because they like to see how these properties have changed over time. So for instance, the two photographs that I have here, the top photo was taken in 1937 by the U.S. Geological Survey, and the McLean house is outlined in red, so you can kind of see Northeast 23rd Street is there towards the bottom of that photo. So you can see it's a relatively rural area. There is some development to the south, and then the photograph to the bottom right was taken in circa 1942, and here I have the house indicated by a red arrow, but here you can see it clearly in context with the state capitol building and the Marland office building. And of course, you see oil derricks indicate the expansion of the oil industry in that area, and also this kind of mix of development that's taking place in within the vicinity of the property. So I gave you a kind of a crash course in the variety of sources that you can use when you're doing research for your historic property. And as I mentioned at the outset, you don't have to use all of those different types of resources. You don't have to use those types of sources, but you need to find that right combination, whether it's the abstract, newspaper articles, and historic photographs, for instance, or newspaper articles with an oral history account and historic photographs and a Sanborn Fire Insurance map, for instance. Find that right combination that can help you answer the following questions. So first off, how many buildings, structures, and other resources make up the property? So in the case of the McLean house, we have one building on the property. There were no other structures or objects on the property. When I was doing the deed research, there was sometimes some evidence of an outbuilding that had perhaps been constructed at some point or those types of things. But by the time, I got the document, the property in 2020 at this case, none of those buildings, outbuildings or anything else was there. It was just this building. Next question, when was the property constructed? When did it attain its current form? For my case, using a combination of the abstract census records, I was able to limit down the period of construction to 1911. What are the property's historic characteristics? Again, this is where the property itself is a primary source of information. So in this case, notable characteristics include the blonde brick exterior with corner coins and the wraparound porch with wood railing. Note the dormer with historic windows. And then also what's not pictured here is the interior, but even the interior retained its original layout and retained many of its historic features and finishes. And then the last question here, what changes have been made over time and when? How have those affected its historic integrity? Again, the property being the primary source of information here, the building had really underwent few significant modifications or alterations. You can notice there's some remnants of vinyl siding over the eaves and soffits. That was installed at an unknown date, but you can also tell that the historic materials is still intact, albeit in poor condition, but still intact underneath those non-original materials. A few more questions. What's the condition of the property? In the case of the McLean house, this is a good discussion of this debate between condition and integrity. The house itself was in fair to poor condition. The porch, as you can see there, was really becoming structurally unsound. It's actually been since this time that the house is undergoing a restoration effort, and they've since had to remove the porch from the building in a sense, to help stabilize the building. And then, of course, they're going to go back in and reconstruct the porch and so forth. But the porch was structurally unsound. However, it retained high degrees of integrity. Retained a high degree of integrity of setting. It was still able to convey that feeling of being a rural house on the outskirts of, or I guess, of what was originally on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. How was the property used during this period of significance, and who occupied or used the property historically? In my research, I was able to figure out that this property was essentially owned by a single family. The property had been vacant for a few years, but the house was built by members of the McLean family. Inhabitants included John, his wife Nellie, and daughters Isla and Frances. And most notably, Isla and Frances, along with Frances's husband and their 3 sons, resided in the house for over 50 years. And I was able to gather all of that information through city directories, census records, newspaper articles, all those things to help just develop that time of use for the property. And even more questions. These last 3 questions here are, kind of the more big picture, like how do we put this property in context? So for instance, how is it associated with important events? How does it relate to the history of a community? Or does it illustrate any themes or trends important to the history of a community or the state or the nation? So in this particular case, for the McLean home, the property was listed for its architectural significance, specifically as an outstanding local example of prairie school style architecture in what was originally the rural outskirts of Oklahoma City. It was listed at the local level of significance. Specifically, very few houses, if any, that date to this period and have retained this degree of integrity in this section of Oklahoma City. And so in terms of the themes or trends that this property relates, the house really illustrates the early rural history of Northeast Oklahoma City. It's somewhat unique in an area that's otherwise characterized by commercial warehouses and offices. And was also potentially even an endangered property given its proximity to the state capitol complex. And the state capitol complex, was expanding and is expanding into that area. And it's kind of a hidden gem, but if you know where to find this property, you come across it, and it's kind of interspersed, within government buildings, and commercial warehouses are around it. But when you come across it, and you can still clearly see that, like, yes, this is, it was historically a country home in rural, outside of the city limits of Oklahoma City. So with that, that is the extent of the presentation. If you have any questions as you're doing your research, don't hesitate to contact me. Again, like as we stated from the outset, contact the SHPO. If you have any questions about a particular property, reach out to our office, and we can find, if we have any, documentation on that property. Before you get too far down that rabbit hole, so to speak, make sure you reach out to us to make sure you're not, covering something that someone's already done,